In this video, we'll be finding out exactly which tyre is best for everyday driving. People often accuse me of focusing too much on ultra high performance tyres, and that's probably true because they're more fun. But tyres like this, which fit cars like this, a BMW 3 Series, are arguably more important because they're sold in greater volumes. These tyres, unlike ultra high performance tyres, have a bit more of their focus on rolling resistance, noise and comfort to give you that more plush everyday experience. To find out which really is the best in the segment, I've collected 6 of the leading tyres from tyre tests around the world and 2 new tyres I've never tested before, a tyre from Falken and a tyre from Pirelli, so it should give us an overview of which is the very best possible for your everyday driving. As usual, I'll be testing them in the dry, wet, aquaplaning, noise, comfort and rolling resistance. Should be an interesting test, so let's get on with the testing.
This video is sponsored by, well, me. Please go review your tyres over at tyrereviews.com. It really helps the channel and the millions of people that use the Tyre Reviews website every month to find the best tyres for themselves. On with the testing.
Wet handling, and why am I talking to you about extreme level handling for tyres that are designed to be cruised upon? They're touring tyres. Well, wet handling not only gives us a good indication of outright grip, which is obviously very important for safety, but also for transient behaviour. It's key because the tyre really can change how a car behaves in something like a high-speed lane change if you have to avoid something. And I know modern cars have got much better with safety systems, but at the end of the day, the tyre does make the difference. Now, the Goodtrip must have been named ironically. Yes, it's the budget tyre. Yes, I'm always mean about budget tyres. And to be fair to the Goodtrip, I'm running 5 tests concurrently this week, and of all the budget tyres, it is the very best of them. However, it doesn't mean it's good. It's still significantly down on the rest, and it gives you that feeling of turn once, turn twice, where you turn the steering wheel, the front end starts to move, the rear tyre compresses, and all of a sudden decides to start to turn as well. And it's just a bit of a mismatch of what's going on. You're kind of surprised with the car. It doesn't feel homogeneous. Is that a word? Let me know. So don't buy cheap tyres. I've said this is my 5th time saying it this week, so I sound like a broken record. It's probably my 1,000,000th time saying it overall. Next up was the Michelin Primacy 4, significantly ahead of the Goodtrip, but significantly behind the rest. Now, the Primacy 4 is an older tyre. It's the Primacy 4 Plus. I'm sure there's a new one due any time now, like the Pilot Sport 4S, and I'm absolutely positive Michelin will take a significant step forward in the wet. The Michelin did feel classic Michelin in that it was very safe, very, very planted, a nice steering tyre. It was just a little bit down on grip, and that caused understeer, and that caused a lack of lap time. Now, from here on up, everything was really, really close. The Firestone in 5th was less than 3% behind the very best, and over such a long lap, that is mighty impressive. The Firestone had good levels of grip, and while it didn't feel remarkable in any way, it didn't feel negative in any way. It was the most tyre of all the tyres, and that is in no way a bad thing. It was stable, it was good to drive on. They've done a good job, especially as this Firestone is categorized as a mid-range tyre. Next up was the Continental PremiumContact 7 in 4th. Now, this is a fraction off the best. Like I said, it's a very, very close group. But this was a slightly different experience I've had before. Now, the PremiumContact 7 is winning pretty much every test it's been in, and it might still win this. This is only one category of test in a test with lots and lots of categories. But it wasn't the very grippiest, and the PremiumContact range has always been my hero amongst the touring tyres in that it was the one that felt a little bit sporty, but in this size, on this vehicle, it didn't. It had a slightly sluggish steering reaction, understeer, and the rear just sat down a little bit after the front. Not as bad as the budget tyre, but it was noticeable. So in this size at least, there are sportier 17-inch tyres, although this isn't a sports test, so I'm guessing this is going to repay back in comfort, and the tyre's going to be very good in comfort. I will find out. So that might be the trade-off Continental have made. Maybe they've made it more appropriate for the class of tyre it's trying to be. That's a lot of words. Next up was Pirelli and Vredestein, essentially tied on time. The Pirelli subjectively was one of the nicest all-round on the vehicle, with lovely steering, well balanced on all the lane changes. Everything happened as you would expect, homogeneously. Again, I'm not sure if that's a word, but it was predictable, and it felt like Pirelli had spent a lot of time making sure the tyre was balanced and it had good grip. The Vredestein was the tiniest amount ahead in terms of lap time, but it just felt, I guess, a little bit more like the Michelin and the Firestone in that it was very planted, stable, but not particularly exciting. And finally, the new Falken. It was the fastest tyre around the lap on average, but like I said, the top 3 tyres are essentially the margin for error. They're all so close. You're not really differentiating much in lap time. I hope wet braking breaks things up, but the Falken, like the Vredestein, was just a little bit dull, a little bit inert. You weren't really enjoying your experiences from a fun point of view, but at no point were you ever surprised or felt unsafe because the grip levels were high and everything was predictable. So excellent job Falken, excellent job Pirelli, Vredestein, Continental, and even Firestone. You've all done an amazing job in wet handling, so let's look at wet braking.
The Continental was back where you would expect to see it, leading the wet braking test with the new Pirelli close behind. Once again, Falken and Vredestein were impressive, and the aging Michelin a little off the front group. Continental also led straight aquaplaning with the Pirelli best in curve, and the Michelin put in a better result in deeper water than shallow.
Dry handling. As always, for dry, we have not just focused on lap time because lap time might not be the most relevant thing for these tyres and these kind of car. But what we have done is spent a lot of time looking at subjective reactions, how the car steers, how it's balanced, whether it's predictable, everything you need to know about the tyres for your everyday driving rounded into one score. Now, things are getting very, very close, which is making my job a little bit more difficult, but luckily, the budget tyre wasn't that close. It was pretty bouncy, pretty elastic, pretty oversteering around the lap, pretty imprecise when not on the lap, when just doing steering reactions, the main gauges, the quick reactions. You'd get the front turning, then the rear would want to come around, and it was just not wonderful. You'd be paranoid when driving. You'd feel exhausted all of the time. Next up was the Vredestein. This had very light steering, and its steering sadly did feel imprecise, a lot better than the budget tyre. A lot further ahead, it just felt the rear took a little bit of time to stabilize compared to the best. And it felt like a very soft constructed tyre, which I have since confirmed it is pretty soft. Conversely, the Firestone, which was around the same time, it might have been slightly quicker. The Firestone felt absolutely lovely sublimate. And I liked how it steered and turned. It's a more solid constructed tyre. Maybe it's not so good in comfort. But the Firestone, the grip got saturated pretty quickly, which meant it was a little bit peaky at limit. So you'd get a little bit of maybe, I would say surprise, but quicker than you'd want oversteer. And that's fun around the lap, but perhaps not ideal. The new Falken felt very good, both sublimit and on the lap. Felt a little bit more sporty than the others so far. I enjoyed driving it around, and the sublimit, it felt very mature and grown up. So good job Falken. It seems to be quite an impressive step forward in every condition for this new tyre. I'm surprised and impressed. The top 3 tyres there who we're used to seeing at the top, it was Continental, Pirelli and Michelin. Now the Conti did feel the most sporty of the 3, but it also felt a little bit elastic on steering response. It turned quickly, but then just took a little bit of time to settle, but buckets of grip for the Continental. Then there were the Michelin and the Pirelli. Now both these tyres, I mark them exactly the same subjectively because sublimit, they were lovely. The Michelin is quite an old tyre now, but it's still just one of the most predictable and rounded tyres, and the new Pirelli seems to have matched that, which made it very difficult for me to pick a favourite for everyday driving. But luckily we also did lap time, and as the Pirelli was the faster of the 2 tyres, then the Pirelli wins by default, so luckily we did the lap time. All in all, like I said, a very close field. You'll be happy with pretty much any of the top 4 or 5, so good job everyone there.
With dry braking one of the easier tasks for tyres, it was naturally insanely close, with the Pirelli and Falken swapping places at the top. But the top 4 were so close, there was essentially nothing in it. As promised, I ran both an external noise test and a subjective comfort test on a specific comfort road to dig in exactly what these tyres would be like to live with in the real world, i.e. rough surfaces, potholes, cobbles and impact bars. The Vredestein did have the lowest noise on test, with the Michelin and Falken extremely close and the Pirelli scoring well too. The Continental was the worst in the noise test, but it wasn't that far off, so I definitely wouldn't be worried about the noise of any of these tyres. I certainly didn't notice it subjectively. Comfort was led by the Michelin Primacy 4+. It's not unusual for this tyre to do well in comfort testing. It just feels great all round and does a fantastic job on big impacts like potholes. In a close second place was Continental and Vredestein. Neither were quite as smooth as the French tyre, but really they weren't too far off. And then it was the Pirelli and Falken, just a tiny bit further behind. Both these tyres felt as good as the best on things like cobbles and stones, but they did transmit a little bit more impact into the chassis when striking hard impacts. The Firestone was good over a single impact, but got a little bit uneasy over constant small bumps like cobbles, and the Goodtrip was still determined to give you a bad trip, as it was quite a lot firmer than the rest of the tyres. The rolling resistance or the energy use of the tyres is becoming more important with every passing year, and a tyre that does rolling resistance well along with everything else is a rare find. Case in point, the Firestone had the lowest rolling resistance by nearly 5% compared to the second place tyre, but it wasn't that great in the wet. If you ignore the Firestone, all the other tyres were incredibly close. I wonder if tyre manufacturers have found a sweet spot with the tyre labelling. Anyway, Pirelli and Continental both did the best job of blending low rolling resistance and wet grip in my opinion, but the Falken and Vredestein were again very close behind. So the overall results. Firmly in last place is the Goodtrip GR66. As I said earlier, it was by no means the worst cheap tyre I've ever used, but then in this size it's not really that cheap, and it's still pretty awful in every test, especially wet braking, which was nearly 40% off the best. That means if you find yourself braking from a highway speed of 70 miles an hour or 130 kph in the wet, you'll still be doing 68 kilometers an hour when you would be stopped on the best. That's a big crash. Next up, you have the Firestone Roadhawk 2 ENLITEN. This tyre lives up to its ENLITEN name with the lowest rolling resistance and was a nicely balanced tyre in the BMW. However, it was lacking just a little bit of whack grip, which cost it a better placing overall. In fifth place is the Michelin Primacy 4 Plus. There's not a lot I can say about this tyre I've not said already. It's a lovely refined tyre to drive but lacks a little bit of grip, especially in the wet. Luckily, the Michelin Primacy 5 has just been announced. I didn't know it was coming when I tested these at the end of last year, and Michelin say the Primacy 5 has much improved wet grip, which sounds extremely promising. Subscribe to see that tyre tested as soon as I can get my hands on it. I'm very excited about it. It has a good sidewall too. Then you have the duo of the Vredestein Ultrac and the Falken ZIEX ZE320, finishing very similarly overall. In fact, looking at the data, it's crazy how close they are, so I'm calling this a joint third. Both tyres had nearly identical dry braking and wet braking. They were both fantastic to drive in the wet. They had pretty much the same straight aquaplaning, though the Vredestein was slightly better in curved aquaplaning, nearly identical noise profiles and just about the same rolling resistance. The Vredestein was a tiny bit better in comfort and the Falken was a tiny bit better in dry handling. So if they're priced similarly in your region, that's your difference. That just leaves the new Continental and the new Pirelli. While the Continental was a little bit behind overall on points, it was again so close I'm calling them joint test winners. As we've come to expect from the PremiumContact 7, this was one of the kings of the wet, with the best wet braking, the best straight aquaplaning, and very good curved aquaplaning. It also had good comfort levels and low rolling resistance, and it was good in the dry. The downside, the balance wasn't quite as good as the Pirelli, otherwise it's still an outstanding tyre. Finally, the brand new, just released Pirelli Cinturato C3 is an excellent upgrade to replace the P7C2. This tyre is now probably the most fun you can have in this category, especially in the dry, and for that I commend it. And it has the grip to match it with the best dry braking. It was also very good in the wet, 1.4 behind the Continental in wet braking, faster in wet handling, and had the best curved aquaplaning. It blends all of that with a low rolling resistance and a low noise. The only slight drawback of the new tyre was the comfort. It scored just half a point behind the Continental, and the differences are that small, so I wouldn't really call it a deciding factor. It still rode very nicely. The sidewall, however, that might decide it for me. In summary, Pirelli have done an excellent job with the new Cinturato C3, continuing their run of excellent form with their new aftermarket tyres. The Continental PremiumContact 7 definitely still has it, and the new Falken and Vredestein products are also outstanding. They're getting very, very close to the best. Obviously, the next question is, can the new Primacy 5 take back the lead? I'm excited to find out. Now, please go review your tyres over at tyrereviews.com. If you want to support independent tyre testing, there is a Patreon. Any questions or comments, please ask below. And as always, safe motoring.